Kia ora koutou, ko Brian Norris, Tika ingoa. So I'm Brian Norris, GM of Customer Experience at Catalyst. We're a New Zealand open source IT company that works across government in a lot of various capacities with most of the ministries and agencies here today. If you want to learn more about us, come and talk to us out in the foyer at morning tea, lunch or afternoon tea. But I'm privileged to be here today wearing two hats. One as a Govis committee member and the second as a sponsor for both of your morning sessions. But my first task this morning is to introduce the keynote speaker, who has dedicated his career to a crucial mission, making public information more accessible to all of us. Andy Neale is the Deputy Chief Executive for Access and Digital Services at the Parliamentary Counsel office here in Wellington. In his role, he leads the publishing of New Zealand legislation and oversees the official legislation website, ensuring that the laws that govern our country are available and understandable to everyone who needs them. Andy brings extensive international experience to his work. Before reimagining how we access and use legislation in New Zealand, he served as Chief Digital Officer at Europeana in The Hague. There he spent over a decade working with libraries, museums and archives, helping to transform cultural collections into accessible digital resources. Throughout his career, Andy has focused on developing digital experiences and operating open information services, always with the goal of making public knowledge more accessible and useful for the people it serves. Today he's going to show us that the secret to thriving in an AI age isn't about having the biggest budget or the smartest algorithms. It's about becoming masterful remixers, learning from our digital ancestors, making small bets that build into big wins. So ladies and gentlemen, the Deputy Chief Executive who turns complexity into clarity, Andy Neale.
Oh, that was quite an intro.
Or edit existing materials to produce something new. The term remix originally applied to music. It rose to prominence late last century during the heyday of hip-hop, the first popular music form to incorporate sampling from existing recordings. Early example, the Sugar Hill Gang samples the bass riff from Chic's Good Times in the 1979 hit Rapper's Delight.
Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet.
Since then, that same bass line has been sampled dozens of times. Skip ahead to the present and anybody can remix anything, music, video, photos, whatever, and distribute it globally pretty much instantly. You don't need expensive tools, you don't need a distributor, you don't even need skills. Remixing is a folk art. Anybody can do it. Yet these techniques, copying materials, transforming them, combining them, are the same ones used at any level of creation. You might even say everything is a remix.
Kia ora koutou, ko Andy Neale aho. Hi everyone, I'm Andy. That intro comes from a documentary called Everything is a Remix by Kirby Ferguson. He's a New York-based filmmaker, and it introduces the idea that creativity comes from reimagining or reworking something that already exists, which is really just like copying stuff and making it your own. For the most part, our way of life is built on the practice of copying and learning and reinventing. And that's what I want to talk about today in the context of digital government. Everything is a remix. And here are the three takeaways that I'd like to leave you with by the end of the talk. 1, creativity is a remix. 2, we've been here before, so what can we learn? And 3, how can we find value by using small bets to ladder up? My pitch is that everything that we need to know about how to support New Zealand and New Zealanders in the next digital era can be inspired by what's come before. So before we get into that proper, though, I want to dive into a mental model for creativity. I love mental models. They're heuristics that help us process complexity. And I've got a mental model I call Creativity Cubed. And it's got 3 cornerstones: ideas, action, and value. In the classic sense, the ability to generate ideas or think differently is perceived as creativity. And we think about things like ingenuity, imagination, adaptability, and the like. But I think that defining creativity as just the process of coming up with an idea is limiting. Ideas are ephemeral. And for me, creativity extends to figuring out how an idea can actually be implemented. And that process is more commonly understood as innovation, right? Manifesting or instantiating an idea. The idea of a painting or a book isn't a creative work until it's actually made. And so it is that ideas must lead to action. But just because you have a creative idea doesn't mean it's a good idea. A creative idea you brought into life doesn't automatically add value. Outside of government, we see this all the time. Someone has an idea for a business, they start a business, and if they're successful, they continue to operate. But if they can't make enough money, then there's no value creation and they fold. And we know this as entrepreneurship. It's the path from idea to action to value creation. And I suggest that the true test of how we creatively solve problems and create opportunities within digital government should be when a new thing gets done that delivers value. And so when you bring into the world something new that delivers something meaningful through ideas, action, and value, that's where I see true creativity, hence Creativity Cubed. And I want you to keep this model in mind as we dive into the past and talk about remixing what's come before. And so the way this is going to work is that I will share an example from the past, let's call it the web era, draw a parallel with something going on or something that's going or coming up in the emerging era, and then share a remix that builds on what we learned. It would be so much more fun, though, if we could actually go back in time. So lucky for you, I brought my Doctor Who-style scarf. So this is a treasured item of mine, and I'm pretty sure it's got enough power to take us into the past. So off we go. So, you probably know where I'm going with this. All right, in 1993, I was in a computer science lab at the University of Otago when a friend leaned over to me and said, "Hey, have you seen this?" And that was the moment that the world shifted for me. On his screen was the Mosaic web browser created by Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina. That first web browser paved the way for the mass adoption of the Netscape browser and the explosion of the web for the general public. Fast forward, and I had that same feeling when I encountered the first GPT models. I remember the wonder of seeing my text, miraculously turning into Shakespeare. And for me, it was that same kind of magic as Mosaic. And then, of course, we had our Netscape moment when ChatGPT arrived, and again, adoption went through the roof. So we've been here before. What can we learn? Well, the web changed how people thought about information and interaction. AI will build on that, but it will then change how people think about knowledge and trust. During the web era, we didn't see those shifts clearly in the moment, though. We were too busy building websites and apps, and in the early days, treating the web mainly as a communication technology. The lesson is that we know this shift isn't just about technology, it's about culture. If we treat AI as just another tool to build and deploy, we'll miss the deeper stuff. We'll miss the deeper shift. We need to take on the mindset of change makers, involving colleagues in the public and shaping the technology through co-design, co-creation, and participative processes, something we didn't really do in the early days of the web. So let's remix what this shift is about. It's not about technology, it's about culture, and we should involve people in shaping the change. All right, let's head back to the 90s again. In the late 90s, we saw the rise of Napster, the MP3 sharing service that let millions of people copy and distribute music for free. It wasn't just Napster. Suddenly music, movies, and text could be copied at scale, and copyright rules felt out of step with reality. A few years later came the Creative Commons movement, offering a legit way for creators to license their material for sharing, remix, and reuse. Creative Commons wasn't a direct result of Napster, but it was certainly part of that broader shift in norms. And by 2010, the New Zealand government responded with our own remix of Creative Commons, our open access and licensing framework, NZ Goal, which actually, I'd like to remind everyone, still encourages us today as agencies to release copyright work for reuse. Excuse me. Now, jump forward again, we're seeing familiar patterns. Anthropic, the makers of Claude, were found to have downloaded more than 7 million pirated books to train their models. The initial ruling said that this wasn't fair use, with potential damages of $1 trillion. In the last few days, we heard they're working on a settlement because, honestly, they would be toast otherwise. The truth is, though, that most of the big AI services we use today have been trained in much the same way. These companies are again responding to the disruption of new technology and shifting norms. So how many of us have stopped using AI services because of their blatant copyright infringement? Anyone? Not many. Just like many from that previous era were quite comfortable copying MP3 files, these are changing norms. So what's different this time? Well, it's not clear yet what responses we'll see because of the challenges again to copyright. Different jurisdictions are taking different approaches. But government doesn't just follow the rules, it makes them, and we role model behaviour. Licensing choices can unlock innovation, and regardless of whether New Zealand ever has a go at training local AI models, we still need Kiwi information sources for systems to query and use, so we can serve our people better. Our agencies collectively hold the largest collection of New Zealand knowledge in the world, which is kind of a weird thing to say, right? Because who else would hold so much New Zealand knowledge? But here at the National Library and at archives next door, we have access to almost every New Zealand published book, newspaper, government record, the early broadcast archives of TVNZ and Radio New Zealand, not to mention copies of the .nz web crawl. But what are we actually doing in our agencies to make information and data safely available for training and reuse? Are you pushing your material to be released and licensed for reuse, or is it sitting locked away because no one is quite sure how to do it properly? Last time, with Creative Commons and NZ Gold, it took us almost a decade to get moving. Copyright is about both innovation and protection, and that takes some figuring out. The remix here is not to wait that long again. Get on and start preparing your material for reuse as training and reference data with the right protections so the country benefits from how it's used by AI systems. All right, let's travel one more time back to the turn of the millennium. In the web era, accessibility was often treated as a bolt-on. And I say was, but if we're honest, are we not still behaving that way? At the time, we focused narrowly on making websites work for screen readers, adding alt text, meeting WCAG checklists. Just a reminder, WCAG is a technical standard for the accessibility of web content. It was launched by the W3C in 1999, and we launched our first New Zealand government web standards in 2003. That work was essential, but it initially framed accessibility as a problem of the page rather than part of a bigger picture of digital inclusion. Even back then, 20 years ago, we saw glimpses of something larger. The shift from static web pages to mobile and responsive design forced us to think more broadly about different devices, contexts, and user needs. Accessibility was never just about the web. It was about creating experiences that worked for everyone in every situation. Now, in the emerging era, accessibility has the chance to grow far beyond the screen. From a universal design perspective, we can imagine conversational and multimodal interfaces that can reduce barriers. Blind and low vision users can interact directly through voice. Deaf and hard of hearing can rely on real-time text or captions. People with cognitive or literacy challenges can request explanations at their own level of understanding. My parents, who might struggle with complex forms, could engage an agent for help rather than navigating endless screens. If the web was about removing barriers to information, then the emerging era might be about replacing barriers with intelligence itself. The remix here is not to focus narrowly on accessibility again, but to start from universal design principles, designing for diversity of age, ability, culture, language, and literacies right from the beginning. Don't treat accessibility as just a checklist. The action you can take here is to design for both people and their expected agents in a multi-path world, one where voice, text, and interaction via different interfaces are all valid entry points, and everyone can choose a path that works for them. Back in the early 2000s, a mini revolution was also changing how data could move around the web. Interoperability was possible, but it was really clunky. We had XML with SOAP web services, powerful, but really heavy and complicated. It was great if you were an enterprise IT shop, but for most developers, it was too hard and the uptake was limited. Then, RESTful APIs arrived. I won't get into the details, but REST was simple, lightweight, and it built on protocols that everyone already knew, HTTP and URLs. So instead of a web page, you could call a URL and get back structured data. That mattered because it pushed digital services beyond the web page. Suddenly data could flow between systems. Developers could create apps, mobile tools, and mashups that no government agency would have imagined. So REST fueled the open data movement of the time, and it changed how we thought about publishing. Fast forward to today, and it feels like we're in the midst of a similar shift. Early AI systems were like early websites. They were self-contained. You went to them, you did a thing, and then you left. But now AI also wants to break out of that box to search the web, file tax returns, make bookings, fill in forms. But the way these systems are wired together is still clunky. And then right on time, something called MCP, or Model Context Protocol, arrives. Richard said it yesterday, context is everything. And this is a way for AI systems to get more context. Developed by Anthropic and adopted by all the big players, it looks like it could be our emerging RESTful moment. It's an open protocol that goes beyond APIs to provide richer capabilities to AI systems. Now, whether it's MCP exactly or something equivalent, we're entering a new era of data interoperability. It's an era where AI tools would be able to access government data in a more intelligent way. But here's the catch. I wonder if AI systems themselves will become commodities. Will there be so many different agents all vying to help us with our daily tasks at home and at work, including interaction with government? And so what do we hold that nobody else does? Trusted data, authoritative services, single sources of the truth that can't be easily replicated or turned into commodity services. And so when I think about reimagining interoperability, I see us moving from data exchange as a communication function to data exchange as a form of trust that will underpin future interactions with government. And so the remix here is to make data capability mechanisms like MCP as trustworthy as passports, providing proof that people are dealing with the real thing. Because what's the point in using an AI service to engage with government if you can't be sure it's drawing on the right data and systems? I mentioned the National Library earlier. I had the privilege of working here for more than a decade, and it's still a very special place for me. But when I arrived in the mid-2000s, I inherited about 80 separate websites and web applications. I was astounded. From the late 90s through to the mid-2000s, digital government went through what I call a period of irrational exuberance. I just like saying that phrase as well, irrational exuberance. At the library, every new feature or collection had become its own website, built on its own bespoke technology. We had PHP, Perl, Python, active service pages, JSP pages. You name it, someone had used it. That was the spirit of the time. Agencies were grappling with the digital shift by grabbing any technology they could and experimenting. But of course, what followed that exuberant expansion was the inevitable big crunch: consolidations, mergers, migrations, and decommissions. In our case, we literally turned old catalogue cards into headstones on a wall, creating an uncomfortably satisfying graveyard for recently deceased websites. Back then, one consequence of all of that exuberance was fragmentation. Every agency went its own way, and we've spent the last 2 decades trying to stitch it back together. There's been good work by good people, but we never quite achieved that dream of streamlined digital front doors for the public. Fast forward to today, and it again feels very familiar. Agencies are spinning up AI pilots and tools as fast as they can. Some are just getting started. That's fine. But in my experience, creativity follows the path of least resistance. Whether you're tinkering in a Copilot playground or downloading models from Hugging Face, the important thing right now is to experiment and learn. But remember, a reckoning will come. Just like the web era, there will be a big crunch where we have to consolidate, standardize, and simplify. The question is, what can we do differently this time? Because I worry that without some kind of shift, the emerging era will just reinforce that fragmentation again. So here's my remix. Instead of everyone going it alone, let's strengthen our alliances and self-organize into clusters of agencies or business groups defined by shared goals, and then collaborate while the page is still relatively blank. And look, this is not something that the GCDO can do for us, because they don't know our business. It's something we have to do for ourselves. Find your partners. Co-creating from the beginning, like developing a prototype together, means there's more chance that joined-up delivery will follow. It will flow from prototypes to pilots to shared services. Don't start talking to each other when you've already built a service and you're hoping to sell other agencies onto it. It's too late for true partnership at that point. Research together, explore and prototype together, and see where that leads you. And then, when the crunch inevitably comes, we'll have a head start, and maybe, just maybe, we can offer New Zealanders a more coherent public service. I've talked a lot about remixing ideas and actions from the past, but what about value? How do you find the things that add the most value? I mean, sure, we can use business cases and economic analysis, and sometimes we do need to do that. But if that's all we do, we will move too slowly. I like to come back to ideas that relate to entrepreneurship, or another framing for this is intrapreneurship for our work in a not-for-profit context. My approach is to make lots of small bets that I can pivot from if I'm not finding the full value that I need. So some of these small bets will work as ladders to take us up to the next level, and some will be snakes that take us back a step. But all of them will teach us something. And if we ladder up these bets, step by step, we can find the opportunities of value that we're looking for. In closing, I want to try and paint this same picture in a different way. Most of you probably don't know a lot about the Parliamentary Counsel office where I work. We're a small office of 115 staff. We draft legislation for government and run, as you heard from Brian, the New Zealand legislation website. We're not a big operation. But here's what value creation looks like for us in the digital space. Here are some of our small bets that we hope will ladder us up. When it comes to involving people and shaping the change and thinking about culture change and not just technology, Here's what we've done so far. We supported a staff working group to create a long list of AI opportunities, narrow it down to 5 use cases, and get involved in research projects. Last week, we also ran a co-design workshop with all managers and asked them to consider what an ambitious adoption of AI might look like for us. So at this point, you're probably feeling a little underwhelmed. All this talk about creativity and Remix, and I roll with a working group and a workshop. But it's not the actions in this case that's the shift. It's the intent. I can tell you that in the late 90s, there was no talk around the table about culture change and participative processes when we were planning out our moves on the web. We were trying to figure out how to turn the freaking marketing brochure developed by comms into a website. So yeah, this is pretty pedestrian, but it doesn't always need to be fancy. When it comes to copyright, legislation is actually already free to use. It doesn't have copyright. So the real focus for us at the PCO is making sure the full body of legislation will be available to AI systems. And here's what that looks like in practice. We've just finished digitizing every act from the statute books all the way back to the 1800s. And that means that future AI systems won't have to rely on models trained on only American or European law. We're also now working to collect all secondary legislation from agency websites and figuring out how to turn thousands of old PDFs into clean, machine-readable HTML. Once we do that, we'll have a complete digital record of copyright-free legislation that can be used by AI systems. With regard to the shift from accessible checklists to universal design, we've taken a very small step into a multi-path future. So researchers have built a chatbot, a prototype for interacting with legislation. And so it's really about helping us learn about these conversational interfaces so that we can plan this work out further. We don't yet have APIs for legislation, so there's still groundwork to do on our data systems before we can enable more sophisticated AI interactions. But we've proposed a new URL standard for giving every piece of legislation a stable URI for 50 years. And that's the first step towards building APIs that we can then layer things like MCP on top of. We need stability. We need good, strong data foundations. We're also floating the idea of digital fingerprints or checksum type systems to authenticate legislation throughout the information supply chain. So, for example, and this is going to sound a little sci-fi, but bear with me, as future AI systems start to run autonomously within regulatory frameworks, right? Because that's where we think things are heading. There will need to be assurance that they're working with the latest official version of the law. So we're trying to figure out how to build trust into open legal data from the ground up. And lastly, when it comes to collaborating and trying to avoid fragmentation, we've formed a cluster with DPMC, Treasury, Ministry for Regulation, among others, to cooperate in the policy to law space. And those 5 R&D use cases that our staff working group chose, they were turned into research projects that have delivered prototypes. The reports and the open source code have all been published online in the hope that we can find others who want to work with us. None of these efforts are revolutionary, and we haven't really broken any new ground with this. We're simply remixing the things that we see around us and reimagining them for our context. I think we sometimes exaggerate the myth of creativity. You know, we see lightning bolts and crazy inventions, but I think what's more important is the practice of building on other people's ideas, getting something in motion, and being prepared to pivot as you try and ladder up. Thanks, everyone. Kia ora.
Thanks, Neil, or should I say the doctor? Or Andy, sorry, the doctor. We've got a few questions that have come through. How are you ensuring that there is enough diversity within your teams for collaboration when considering and developing AI implementation or integration?
So I take that to be a people question about diversity. I think diversity, as we heard yesterday with the talk on neurodiversity, comes in a lot of different ways. And I think it's about, it comes back to reaching out across the business. It's actually not just about, the immediate team that I work with. It's actually about the whole business. In the 5 research projects that we undertook, we had an extensive group of subject matter experts, probably totaling across, maybe 15, 20 from across the business. And that's where we kind of get our diversity from across the business. Because, teams can be small. You don't always have the full diversity you have in your immediate team that you like, and that's where you've got to look out beyond those smaller teams to, across the organisation or even outside of it. And that's partly also why we're really keen on collaborating on this work, because other organisations have other sources of diversity and perspective which are really valuable.
Thanks, Andy. Time for another one or two. What do we do if we don't have a lot of funding or in-house AI expertise?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that's kind of our situation as a small agency. I think the starting point is looking for enthusiasm with the organisation and looking for really anyone who is showing a bit more of an interest and energy in this space, because if you've got someone who's or people who are energetic, then they will learn and they will put themselves out there and figure things out. So I think that's the starting point. The second thing is, we don't have any in-house technical capability in this space. I think, like many places, we're still developing or figuring that out. I do think that even just within Wellington, we've got an incredible resource available to us with the many small and medium-sized companies here. That's what we did with our research projects. We had a very small budget, and if anyone wants to know exactly how much we've spent, come and talk to me afterwards. I'm happy to tell you. But it was a very small budget for each use case. And we were just delighted with the response from local companies who wanted to get in and work alongside us and help figure it out. And I think they got as much from it as we did on those prototypes. So you kind of have to be creative about how you spend your money as well. Part of the ethos for us was of going the open source route was so we could put it out there and we could talk about it. And I think the companies that we worked with really benefited from that, because we said at the outset, hey, come and do this stuff with us, and then you can tell people about what you've been doing. And we'll put it out there, and they really appreciated that, I think.
Probably got time for one last one. As well as legislation being fed into AI agents, can you include wider legislation processes, policy, cabinet papers, public submissions, parliamentary debates, e.g.?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. What we're doing with the New Zealand legislation website is we're bringing together all of the core legislation, the acts, the secondary legislation. But what we then see happening is linking out to other sources of information. We don't need to hold everything centrally in order to create a linked data set. So just one very simple example, the Hansard transcriptions that relate to legislation. Well, they're hosted by the Parliamentary Service, not the Parliamentary Service. They're hosted by somewhere else. But we can link to that, and we can create that data set. You don't need to bring everything into your direct control. I think the other thing to say is that I mentioned an emerging cluster with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and Ministry for Regulation and Treasury, and that is kind of the idea we're thinking about there, is how do we bring all that information together, cabinet papers and policy papers and so on, into a single system we're not quite sure. But that's the kind of thing you would expect from collaboration. And I think you'll all have examples of that in your own space where there's benefits of doing similar things with related agencies or business groups.
So thank you, Andy. Much appreciated. It was a great talk, and just like everyone to thank Andy.